In the year 1173, two children emerged from the ancient wolf pits of Woolpit, their skin the pale green of dying moss. They spoke in sounds like distant bells, recoiled from bread as if it were poison, and devoured only raw beans with desperate hunger. The boy died within days. The girl claimed they came from a land of eternal twilight, following beautiful sounds through caverns until they fell into our bright, burning world. But when Father Alaric took her back to find the passage home, they found only empty earth and broken dreams. The year of our Lord 1173 was a wet one. The sky over the Suffolk village of Woolpit was a bruised and weeping grey, and the ground had softened into a perpetual mire. The air, thick with the smell of damp wool and wood smoke, clung to everything. It was the kind of weather that bred fear. Fear of rot in the fields, of sickness in the lungs, and of omens in the very trees. Today, the omen was a gnarled willow that stood sentinel by the village common. Its branches, heavy with moisture, were weeping a sticky, resinous substance that the villagers had declared to be the tears of a vengeful spirit, a sure sign of a coming plague. Father Alaric stood before the tree. A crowd of his flock gathered at a respectful distance. He was a man in his 40s, lean and sharp-featured, with eyes that held the weary intelligence of someone who had read too many books by candlelight. He watched their faces, pinched with a familiar, frustrating anxiety. The village reeve, a stout man named Edwig, whose authority was rooted in tradition and fear, stood beside him, arms crossed over his barrel chest. "It is a portent, Father," Edwig declared, his voice a low rumble. "The spirits of the wood are displeased." Alaric sighed, a faint wisp of condensation in the chill air. He ran a hand over his tired face before stepping forward. "It is sap, Edwig. Nothing more." He reached out and touched one of the weeping branches, his fingers coming away coated in the glistening substance. He held his finger up for them to see. "There is no spirit. There is no curse. There is only cause and effect, the beautiful and logical order God has given us." His tone was patient, the practiced cadence of a teacher explaining a simple concept to a classroom of slow-witted children. The unusual damp has brought forth an abundance of aphids, tiny insects. They feed upon the willow sap, and what they cannot digest, they excrete. This sticky residue is what you see. It is not tears, but insect honey. A nuisance, perhaps, but not a message from the beyond. To demonstrate, he scraped a bit of the goo from the bark and smeared it on a flat stone, using a shard of flint to magnify the afternoon's weak light. He pointed to the minuscule, dark specks trapped within. "Behold, your spirits." The villagers shuffled, murmuring amongst themselves. They looked from the insects on the stone to Alaric's calm, authoritative face. They were not convinced, not truly, but they were cowed by his certainty. His knowledge, so different from their own, was a kind of magic in itself, a cold, hard magic that left no room for the terrible poetry of their fears. For Alaric, explaining the world was a way of taming it. He saw superstition as a rival faith, a chaotic religion of fear that he was duty-bound to dismantle, one weeping willow at a time. He believed in a God of reason, whose miracles were written in the predictable turning of the seasons and the logical mechanics of the natural world. But the world was about to present him with a problem that logic could not so easily contain. Later that day, under the same oppressive sky, the rhythmic swing and cut of sickles filled the air near the eastern fields. A group of reapers, their backs aching and their brows slick with sweat, worked to bring in the harvest. The field bordered a place the villagers avoided a series of deep, dry pits, dug generations ago to trap wolves. They were now overgrown and half forgotten, mouths of shadow in the earth. Suddenly, a sound unlike any other cut through the air. It was not the cry of a beast or a bird. It was a high, chittering harmony, like the clinking of dissonant, frantic bells. All work stopped. The reapers stood frozen, their sickles held motionless. They exchanged wide-eyed, fearful glances. The sound was coming from the pits. A young man named Thomas, bolder, or perhaps more foolish than the rest, crept toward the edge of the nearest pit. He peered over, his face a mask of apprehension. A moment later, he scrambled back, shouting in alarm, his voice cracking. "Sweet Mother of God, there's something down there." The others rushed to the edge, their tools now held like weapons against an unknown threat. They looked down into the shadows of the ancient trap. Huddled at the bottom, blinking against the intrusive light, were two small figures, two children. Their terror was palpable, but it was not the most shocking thing about them, not by a long shot. The simple stone church felt like a fortress against the coming night. Tallow candles sputtered in their sconces, casting long dancing shadows that clung to the damp walls. Before the altar stood the children from the pit. They had been brought to Father Alaric, as all inexplicable things were, a problem for God so representative to solve. The boy and the girl were small, no older than 7 or 8. They huddled together, their fingers intertwined in a desperate grip. But it was their skin that held every gaze, that silenced every tongue. It was green, not the vibrant green of summer leaves, but the pale, sickly, unsettling green of moss on a dying tree. Their clothes were just as strange, woven from a coarse, unfamiliar fibre, the colour of dull brass, and cut in a style Alaric had never seen. They chattered at him, their voices a torrent of the same bell-like, incomprehensible sounds the reapers had heard. It wasn't a language. It was a cascade of noise. Alaric, a scholar before he was a priest, began his methodical process of diagnosis. "Pax vobiscum," he said, his voice calm and even, offering the Latin blessing of peace. The children merely stared, their large dark eyes, shaped like almonds, holding a profound and unnerving depth. He tried again, this time in the Norman French of the gentry. "Qui êtes-vous? Who are you?" Nothing, only the ceaseless alien chittering. He switched to the halting, earthy Saxon of the villagers themselves. Still nothing. It was as if he were speaking to creatures from another world entirely. Edwig, the reeve, stood by the heavy oak door, his face grim. "They are Fae-Folk, Father, stolen from the hollow hills. They will bring a curse." Alaric ignored him, his mind a whirlwind of rational possibilities. A lost family of Flemish weavers. They settled to the east, but the language is not theirs, nor is the colour of their skin. A disease, some affliction of the blood that turns the flesh this ghastly shade. Perhaps they chewed on a poisonous root, copper or arsenic. He fetched a loaf of bread from the rectory and broke off a piece, holding it out to them. The children recoiled as if it were a hot coal. They looked at the bread with a complete lack of recognition, their small faces blank. They were hungry. Alaric could see the hollows in their cheeks beneath the green hue. But they did not know what bread was. This single fact was more disturbing than anything else. To not know bread was to not know the world, to not. He stood there in the flickering candlelight, the priest of a rational God, confronted by two impossible children. They were a living, breathing violation of natural law. They did not fit into any category his learning could provide. They were not simply lost, they were wrong. And as he looked into their dark, terrified eyes, Father Alaric felt the first cold tremor of a fear he had not known in years, the fear of the truly unknown. His ordered world had just been invaded. The rectory was Alaric's sanctuary, a small stone house crammed with the quiet company of books and the lingering scent of beeswax and drying herbs. He had brought the children here from the church, away from the prying eyes of the village. This was his laboratory, a place of reason where the chaotic world could be examined, categorized, and understood. The two children sat on a small wooden stool near the hearth, their green faces illuminated by the low fire, their dark eyes following his every move. He began his experiment. A systematic investigation was the only way to peel back the layers of this impossibility. First, he set down the rejected bread on a plate, alongside a slice of salted pork and a piece of cooked turnip. He gestured to the food, his expression encouraging. The children stared, their faces betraying no sign of comprehension. The food was as alien to them as they were to him. They made no move. Frustration began to prick at Alaric's composure. He tried an apple, its red skin a vibrant contrast to their own strange pallor. He bit into it himself, a loud crunch to demonstrate its purpose. Still nothing. They were starving, he was sure of it, yet they were surrounded by sustenance they refused to acknowledge. His logic was failing. These were not the actions of lost Flemish weavers or children suffering from any known ailment. Their behavior itself was a symptom, one that fit no earthly disease. Dejected, he began to clear the food away. His eyes fell upon a basket near the door, filled with broad beans he had picked from his garden that afternoon, their pods still plump and green. On a desperate whim, a final, illogical test, he brought the basket and set it before them. The reaction was instantaneous and profound. The children's eyes, previously dull with exhaustion, widened with an electric shock of recognition. A frantic, chittering sound erupted from them both as they scrambled forward, falling upon the basket. Their small, green-tinged hands were a blur, snatching the pods, cracking them open with an audible snap, and scooping the raw, pale beans into their mouths. They ate with a desperate, primal hunger that was terrifying to behold. They did not chew so much as crush and swallow, their focus absolute, the rhythmic crunching filling the silent room. Alaric watched, frozen in place. A flicker of intellectual triumph sparked within him. He had found a clue, a data point. This was the first piece of the puzzle that fit anywhere. But the triumph was immediately smothered by a wave of deeper, more profound puzzlement. Why only this? Why raw? It was a discovery that explained nothing. A key that opened a door onto an even darker and more bewildering room. The next morning, the village market was a swirling eddy of humanity. The air was thick with the smell of livestock, fresh baked bread, and gossip. As Alaric walked through the crowd, a path cleared before him. Conversations died, replaced by furtive whispers and the quick, almost involuntary gesture of a hand signing against the evil eye. He was no longer just their priest. He was the keeper of the Green Children, the custodian of the village's new living omen. A sharp voice cut through the murmurs. Father Alaric. It was Elspeth, the village midwife. She was a woman in her 60s, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes as sharp and knowing as a crow-s. She stood with a basket of herbs on her hip, her authority as ancient and rooted in the soil as his was in stone and scripture. You cannot keep them, she said, her voice low but carrying. They are not of our world. They are born of the earth, without souls christened by God. They are children, Elspeth, Alaric replied, forcing his tone to remain steady, lost and afraid. They are a curse, she countered, her gaze unwavering. They appear as the harvest is gathered. They eat only the bean, the very seed of our sustenance, raw from the pod like a grub. Can you not see the sign? They are a blight in human form. Keeping them in the shadow of the church is a blasphemy. You invite famine, you invite plague. Alaric saw the villagers nearby nodding in agreement, their faces tight with fear. He could offer them logic. He could speak of coincidence, but he knew it would be useless. Their fear was not a thing of the mind. It was a thing of the gut. He saw in their eyes that his problem was no longer a private intellectual puzzle. It was now a public battle, and he was defending the fragile fortress of reason against a rising tide of collective hysteria. He offered Elspeth a curt nod and walked away, her warning echoing in his ears, planting a cold seed of doubt not in their beliefs, but in his ability to ever overcome them. The boy was fading. Over the next few days, a deep lethargy settled over him. He refused even the raw beans now, pushing them away with a weak hand. The green of his skin seemed to deepen, taking on the dark, unhealthy hue of bruised fruit. Alaric, in a state of quiet desperation, did what he could. He was a man of learning, and his books held the accumulated medical knowledge of centuries. He brewed a thin broth of boiled herbs meant to balance the body's humors and chase away melancholic afflictions. He tried to spoon the warm liquid into the boy's mouth, but the child's head turned away, his lips sealed. The girl never left her brother's side, her silent terror a palpable presence in the small rectory. She would touch his face, her strange bell-like words now soft and pleading. One night, with a storm rattling the wooden shutters, Alaric sat by the fire, a heavy Latin text open on his lap. He scanned the pages for any mention of such a condition, a wasting sickness that turned the skin green, that created a revulsion to all normal food. He found descriptions of chlorosis, the green sickness that afflicted young women, but the symptoms did not match. He read of poisonings, of fluxes of the bowel, of fevers that consumed the spirit. Nothing fit. His knowledge, his science, the entire edifice of human reason contained in his library, was proving to be a useless tool against this silent, creeping thief. He must have dozed off, his head slumped against the high back of his chair. He was woken by a change in the room's texture. The sound of the boy's shallow, rasping breath had stopped. In its place, there was only the drumming of the rain and the crackle of the fire. And then, a soft, final sigh from the corner where the children slept on a pallet of straw. Alaric's heart seized. He rushed over, his candle casting a trembling light. The boy was still. His eyes were closed, his small chest motionless. The life had gone out of him. A moment of pure, suspended silence fell. Then the girl let out a sound of such profound, heart-wrenching grief that it seemed to shake the very stones of the rectory. It was not the cry of a child, but an ancient, soul-deep wail of absolute loss. Alaric stood over the small, still body, the useless book forgotten on the floor. He was helpless, defeated. The problem had not been solved. It had merely been ended by death. His reason, his medicine, his faith in an ordered world, all of it had shattered against the rocks of this inexplicable tragedy. He was no longer a scholar observing a phenomenon. He was a man who had watched a child die, and he had been powerless to stop it. In the silent weeks that followed the boy's death, a funereal quiet settled over the rectory. The grief of the surviving girl was a physical presence in the room, a heavy blanket that smothered all sound. Alaric buried her brother in the consecrated ground behind the church, a small, unmarked grave for a child with no name and no past. He performed the rites, but the Latin words felt hollow, a formal ritual applied to a reality that was anything but formal. The girl, whom he had begun to call Agnes, slowly, haltingly, began to return to the world. Her green skin, which had seemed to darken with her brother's decline, began to soften, taking on a lighter, more vibrant hue. Alaric found a new purpose in her survival. His mission was no longer to solve the puzzle of her origin, but to anchor this lonely, living piece of it to the world. He began to teach her. Day after day, he would sit with her by the fire, his patient finger pointing to the objects that made up his life. Bread, he would say, holding up a crust. She had, by necessity, learned to eat it, though she still did so with a strange reluctance. Bread, she would repeat, her pronunciation a strange musical distortion of the familiar word. Water, water, fire, fire. Language, the ultimate tool of reason, was building a bridge across the chasm of their mutual strangeness. A tentative bond began to form. He would find her watching him as he read, her dark, almond-shaped eyes filled with a quiet, searching intelligence. In these moments, she was not an anomaly or a specimen. She was simply Agnes, a child in his care. Hope, which had died with her brother, began to send out a fragile green shoot in the desolate landscape of Alaric's mind. One afternoon, he found her sitting on the floor, scratching at a piece of slate with a nub of charcoal. He expected childish scribbles, but what he saw made him stop. It was a landscape. There were strange, drooping trees and figures that must have been her family's flock. But above it all, she had drawn a sun. It was not the blazing, radiant circle a child of this world would draw. It was a dim, muted orb, its rays depicted as soft, diffused lines, as if it were shining through a perpetual fog. It was a sun with no heat, no power. It was the sun of a twilight world. This was not a simple drawing. It was a memory. For the first time, she was not just repeating his words. She was communicating an idea, an experience entirely her own. The storm broke that night with a theatrical fury, throwing sheets of rain against the rectory's wooden shutters and screaming in the chimney. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and with every clap of thunder, Agnes flinched, her body tensing with fear. Alaric stoked the fire, the warm light pushing back against the raging darkness. He saw in her agitation a reflection of the night her brother died. He knelt beside her. "Agnes," he said softly, using their now familiar simple vocabulary. "Do not be afraid. It is only the wind." He paused, then, guided by an impulse he didn't fully understand, he asked the question that had haunted him for weeks. He pointed to his own chest. "Alaric, Woolpit." Then he pointed to her. "Agnes, where from?" She stared into the dancing flames, her eyes wide. The storm outside seemed to be pulling a memory from the depths of her mind. When she finally spoke, her voice was a near whisper, her broken English weaving a story that made the storm outside seem tame and rational. "We come from St. Martin's land," she began, her words slow and deliberate. "No sun. Not like this sun." She pointed towards the ceiling, towards the sky. "Always twilight." Alaric grabbed his quill and inkpot, his heart pounding. He began to write, his hand flying across the parchment of his journal, desperate to capture every word. "There is a river," she continued, her eyes unfocused, lost in the memory. "A river of light. It makes the twilight. We live by the light river." She described herding her father's flock, the animals as strangely colored as she and her brother had been. Then her expression shifted. "We hear a sound, so loud, like big bells, beautiful." She gestured with her hands, a swirling motion. "We follow sound, into cavern, a cave." She looked at Alaric, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "Long walk, in the dark, long, long walk. Then too much light, too bright. We fall down, at the mouth of the pit." She fell silent. The only sounds were the roar of the wind, the hiss of the rain, and the frantic scratching of Alaric's quill. He stared at what he had written, at her testimony. It was a complete, consistent, and cohesive narrative. It explained her fear of the bright sun. It explained why she and her brother had been found in the pit. It explained everything, and yet it was utterly, fantastically impossible. There was no St. Martin's land on any map. There were no rivers of light in any chronicle. His scientific mind, his entire framework for reality, was being dismantled by the quiet, halting words of a 7-year-old girl. He was no longer dealing with a traumatized, lost child. He was dealing with a witness to the impossible. A week later, Alaric rode his weary mule through the gates of the Abbey of St. Edmund. He needed answers. He needed the comfort of established knowledge, the authority of scholars who had dedicated their lives to the study of the world. In the vast, cold library of the Abbey, surrounded by thousands of scrolls and bound manuscripts, he felt a momentary peace. This was the accumulated reason of mankind. Surely the answer was here. He showed his journal, his meticulous notes on Agnes's diet, her skin, her language, and her incredible story, to the head librarian, a man named Brother Simeon. Simeon was kind, his face placid, his intellect sharp and incisive. He listened patiently, his fingers steepled. When Alaric had finished, Simeon nodded slowly. A fascinating tale, father. A true puzzle. He then proceeded to solve it with a calm, dismissive certainty. The children were almost certainly Flemish, he explained, pulling a heavy chronicle from a shelf. You know, many weavers from Flanders settled in this region after being exiled by the king, see? He pointed to a passage. They were persecuted, forced to live in the forests and fens. It is likely the children were lost, their parents perhaps killed, their story of another world. A fantasy. A fiction woven by a mind shattered by trauma. And their skin? Alaric asked, his voice betraying his desperation. Arsenic poisoning, perhaps, from the dye-making process the weavers use, Simeon offered. Or, more likely, the green sickness, a form of severe malnutrition. It can give the skin a pale, greenish cast. It would explain their strange diet and the boy's eventual decline. It was a perfect, elegant, and completely rational explanation. It accounted for everything. Alaric clutched it like a drowning man clutching a piece of driftwood. He thanked Brother Simeon, his mind reeling with relief. It was a fantasy, a trauma-induced delusion. But as he rode home, the librarian's neat explanation began to unravel. He tried to fit Agnes' specific, detailed testimony into the framework of a lost Flemish girl, but it didn't fit. Flemish weavers did not live in a land of perpetual twilight. Malnutrition did not create memories of a river of light or the sound of beautiful giant bells. The rational explanation was a container too small for the story it was meant to hold. It was logical, it was comforting, and Alaric knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it was wrong. He was caught between an impossible testimony he was beginning to believe and a rational explanation that felt like a hollow lie. His faith in the ordered world of men and books was cracking, and he did not know what would be left when it finally broke. The hollow comfort of the librarian's explanation did not last the ride home. In the days that followed, Alaric found himself in a state of intellectual limbo. He was a man adrift between two shores, the solid land of reason, which he could no longer stand on, and the misty island of the impossible, which he could not yet bring himself to fully inhabit. He watched Agnes, listened to her strange musical accent as she learned more of his language, and saw not a traumatized Flemish girl, but a visitor from a place he couldn't comprehend. And then, the world began to answer his doubt with fear. A blight, swift and merciless, fell upon the village's bean crop. The very plants that had sustained Agnes now withered in the fields, their leaves turning black, their pods shriveling into empty, rotting husks. For the villagers, the chain of cause and effect was simple, brutal, and undeniable. One morning, the sound of an angry crowd drew Alaric to the church door. It was Elspeth, the midwife, and behind her stood a small mob of 24 villagers. Their faces were grim, their eyes burning with a righteous fury. They carried the blighted beanstalks, holding them up like macabre standards. "This is your work, father." Elspeth's voice was a ragged shriek. "You harbor a demon, and it has poisoned our fields. The bean-eater has cursed us," another man shouted, shaking a blackened stalk at the church. "She eats the life of the crop and leaves us with death." Agnes, hearing the commotion, appeared behind Alaric, her small hand clutching the back of his cassock, her face pale with terror. The sight of her, her green-tinged skin seeming to glow in the morning light, sent a fresh wave of horror through the crowd. Alaric stood at the church door, a bastion between the girl and their fear. He raised a hand, calling for calm, and tried to deploy the tools that had always served him. "This is not a curse," he called out, his voice straining to be heard over their anger. "It is a rot, born of the endless rain and the damp soil. It is a natural affliction, a trial sent by God, not a hex sent by a child." His words, once the final authority in Woolpit, were now meaningless noise. They were the empty pronouncements of a leader who had lost his way, who had chosen to protect the source of their terror over the well-being of his flock. His logic, his reason, was a shield of glass against the stone of their collective hysteria. He was no longer their wise priest. He was the protector of the curse. He looked at their faces, twisted by fear into something ugly and unrecognizable, and knew that reason had failed. He had to find another way. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple, Alaric made a decision. If the world of men and their books held no answers, he would have to seek one in Agnes' world. Driven by a desperation that had finally extinguished the last embers of his skepticism, he took her by the hand and led her from the rectory. "Agnes," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "take me to the pit. Take me to where you were found." They walked in silence, away from the village and towards the eastern fields. The wolf pits seemed different now in the dying light. They were no longer just ancient holes in the ground. They felt charged with a potent significance, each one a possible doorway to the place she described. Alaric's heart hammered in his chest. He was no longer debunking a story. He was actively participating in it, testing its fantastical premise on its own terms. He had brought a torch and flint, fully prepared to light it and follow her into the earth if she found the way. It was a complete surrender. His scientific worldview had failed, his reason had failed, his authority had failed. All that was left was her story. All that was left was to believe. "Show me, Agnes," he whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of hope and terror as they stood at the edge of the pit she had first appeared in. "Show me the cavern." Night fell completely, leaving them in a profound darkness, broken only by the shimmering light of the stars. Alaric struck his flint, and the torch blossomed to life, its flames casting long, dancing shadows that turned the familiar landscape into something alien and alive. By this flickering light, Agnes began her search. She descended into the pit, her small hands running over the damp earth and exposed roots of the walls. She moved with a frantic energy, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "Here," she would murmur, her fingers digging into the dirt. It was here. She moved from one spot to another, her initial hope visibly draining away, replaced by a rising panic. She clawed at the packed soil, her nails breaking, her search growing more desperate with every passing moment. Alaric stood on the edge above her, his own hope tied to her search, his stomach twisting into a cold, hard knot. He said nothing, simply holding the torch aloft, his knuckles white. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she stopped. Her small shoulders slumped. She slid down the earthen wall and curled into a ball at the bottom of the pit, her body racked with sobs. "It is gone," she wept, her voice muffled by the dirt. "The way is gone. There was no opening. There was no cavern. There was nothing but damp soil and gnarled roots." Alaric stood over her, the torchlight illuminating the pathetic scene. The scientific explanation didn't fit. The superstitious one had just led to this pathetic dead end. He was left with nothing. No neat conclusion from a scholarly monk, no magical doorway to another world, just an impossible story with no proof, and a heartbroken child weeping in a hole in the ground. He was a priest who had lost his faith in reason, a scholar who had found no truth in myth. He was utterly and completely lost. Alaric stood in the pit, the torch sputtering in his hand, a man hollowed out by the failure of all his beliefs. Agnes' sobs had subsided into shuddering, exhausted breaths. In the crushing silence, there was no comfort, no explanation, only the cold, hard finality of a dead end. But the silence was not to last. A sound began to drift from the direction of the village, a low murmur at first, then the unmistakable sound of angry voices, growing closer. A moving constellation of orange lights appeared over the rise, bobbing and weaving through the darkness. Torches. Alaric's blood ran cold. He pulled Agnes to her feet, instinctively shielding her behind him as the mob spilled into the clearing around the pits. It was Elspeth, and beside her, the Reeve, his face a grim mask of certainty. Behind them, the faces of his flock were illuminated by the firelight, their expressions stripped of all reason, leaving only raw primal fear. They had tracked them. "There they are!" Elspeth's voice sliced through the night. The priest and his demon, hiding in the very wound in the earth they sprang from. The mob formed a ring around the pit, their torches held high, creating a suffocating circle of light and heat. They were no longer just men and women. They were a single entity, a beast with many heads, driven by a single terrifying thought. The Reeve, Edwig, pointed a thick finger down at Agnes. "We will have no more of this curse, Father. The blight is a sign. Her presence defiles this land. We will return the Fae child to the earth," Elspeth declared, her eyes gleaming with fanatical light. "Leave her in the pit. The ground that birthed her can swallow her again, and the curse on our fields will be lifted." They began to advance, their feet shuffling in the dirt, the circle tightening. They were coming down into the pit. Alaric looked at their faces, at the friends and neighbors he had baptized and prayed with, and saw only the terrifying power of a belief that has curdled into hate. His science was useless here. His scripture felt just as powerless. He stood before the weeping girl, his back against the cold, unyielding earth. He looked around for a weapon, a symbol, anything. His eyes fell not on the cross around his neck, but on a sturdy fallen branch lying nearby. He picked it up. It felt solid in his hand, real and of this world. He held it before him, not like a club, but like a staff, and waited. He did not preach. He did not argue the science of crop rotation or the finer points of theology. He looked into the faces of his flock, his own face streaked with dirt and despair, and he spoke with the quiet, broken authority of a man who had lost everything, including his certainty. "I do not know where she comes from," he began, his voice barely more than a whisper, yet it cut through their angry murmurs. The sheer honesty of it surprised them into silence. "I do not know if she was sent by God, or if she crawled from the earth itself. I have searched the books of men, and I have found no answer. I have searched for the door to her world, and I have found nothing." He paused, his gaze moving from one face to the next, forcing them to see him not as a priest, but as a man. "All my knowledge has failed. All my reason has come to naught. I am left knowing only this." He gestured with the branch towards Agnes, who peeked out from behind him, her face a mess of tears and dirt. "She is a child. She is alone. Her brother is dead. She is afraid, and she is in our care." He took a step forward, his voice gaining a strength born not of arrogance, but of a simple, profound conviction. To harm a child out of fear of the unknown, to answer a blight in the fields, with a blight upon your own souls, that is a greater sin than any witch or demon could ever conjure. If God is testing us, this is the test, not the harvest, her. His confession of ignorance had become his greatest strength. It disarmed them. They had come expecting a sermon, an argument, a condemnation. They received instead the plain, undeniable truth. A few of the villagers lowered their torches, their faces flickering with shame. The beast of the mob began to fracture, to remember that it was made of men. Edwig and Elspeth held their ground, but the fire in their eyes had dimmed. They had lost their momentum. One by one, then in small groups, the villagers began to turn away, shuffling back into the darkness, leaving the quiet shame of their actions behind them. Years passed. The rectory was a brighter place now. Sunlight streamed through a larger window Alaric had installed, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. An older father, Alaric, his hair now the color of snow, sat at his desk. His face was lined with the maps of his age and his experiences, but his eyes, once filled with a weary intelligence, now held a quiet peace. A young woman of about 20 moved about the room, her steps light and graceful. It was Agnes. The green of her skin had long since faded to a healthy, normal pallor, though her features remained unique, a testament to her mysterious origin. She spoke fluent English now, her voice a strange and beautiful music. She placed a cup of steaming tea at Alaric's elbow. He looked up at her and smiled, a gesture of simple, familial affection. His gaze fell back to the manuscript on his desk, the chronicle of his life, of her life. He dipped his quill in the ink pot and, with a steady hand, wrote the final lines of his account. Whether her tale be true or a fable born of sorrow, I cannot say. I have, in my life, learned the folly of certainty. I only know that she was found, and she was saved, and I, in turn, was saved by her. The rest is a mystery best left to God. He set the quill down. The question of where Agnes came from was never answered, but for Alaric, it no longer mattered. The goal was not to solve the puzzle of the world, it was to live within it, with compassion in the face of its profound and beautiful mysteries. What's so fascinating about the legend of the Green Children isn't just the mystery of where they came from, but the battle over what makes for a satisfying answer. On one hand, you have the clean, logical explanation presented in the story. The children were likely lost Flemish immigrants, their green skin a symptom of malnutrition, their tale of another world a fantasy born of trauma. It is scientific. It is plausible. It neatly explains away the impossible. But as we follow Father Alaric's journey, that neat explanation starts to feel hollow, almost disrespectful. It dismisses the most powerful piece of evidence in the entire story, Agnes's own testimony. Her personal account of a twilight land has an emotional truth that the cold, impersonal theory of malnutrition simply cannot touch. The story seems to argue that a truth that erases a person's lived experience, no matter how fantastic, isn't much of a truth at all. In the end, Alaric doesn't choose superstition over science. He chooses a third path, compassion in the face of a mystery he cannot solve. He accepts that he doesn't know, and that, perhaps, he doesn't need to. So, it leaves us with a question. When you are faced with a choice between a logical explanation and an impossible story that holds deep personal meaning for someone, which do you believe is more important?